This is a website called climatecosmos.com. At first glance, it appears to be a relatively normal website writing articles about climate change, but spend more than about 10 seconds on it and you notice that things are a bit odd. Their articles are very generic. They don't interview any experts. The topics of articles are sometimes completely bizarre, sandwiching articles with information about climate change between those that push an anti-science agenda. And then
they published a piece called What the Climate Movement Isn't Telling You. And the piece read, I'll help you write an article about what the climate movement isn't telling you with current facts and data. Let me search for the latest information.
This website is AI Slop. And this is Joey Grosstern, a journalist at DSMOG, the investigative reporting site specializing in climate misinformation. A few months ago, I learned of Climate Cosmos and passed it over to Joey to do some digging. And what he uncovered was a bizarre new form of climate misinformation. One that shows how the information landscape around climate change is in danger and raises questions about what we can and should do to safeguard that landscape.
to begin with, let's look at Climate Cosmos in a bit more detail.
So you'll have one piece that's like a listicle saying something like the top 10 snowiest cities in Hawaii or something nonsensy that's very obviously like there to draw clickbait. And then like sort of every third or fourth article would be like the secret hidden costs of the green transition. And then quote Bjorn Lomborg, who is a kind of very prominent like anti-net zero voice. So we did more of a deep dive into the site, trying to look at who owns the site, who's behind it, you know, all these kinds of things. On the About page, they listed staff members. And we found this site maybe 4 months ago. Back then, the staff members had AI-generated pictures and untraceable social media footprints. So at that point, it was kind of clear, okay, maybe these aren't even real people. Things have changed. They seem to have aligned, swapped out these AI-generated profiles for real people, or what we think are real people online. We did some digging into who owns the companies. It turns out Climate Cosmos is part of a group called Next Vision Media. This is a German startup media business. Next Vision Media don't just do climate content. They have a few AI-generated sites. There were like home decoration sites. There was all kind of like really random seeming topics where you'd think, okay, if this is a media business dedicated to climate content, why do they have a site called Home Harmony that's about how to like decorate your living room?
And all of these websites feature AI-generated content. In fact, each website includes a disclaimer saying they will flag any use of AI, but that article that included the prompt to the LLM didn't have any such notice of AI-generated content. But why? Like, why bother setting up all these companies and churning out AI-generated content about climate change?
Normally, the answer would be for advertising revenue. Put out a bunch of clickbait articles, monetize users coming to your website, and you have a passive income source.
But Climate Cosmos and its sister sites don't run advertising. There is the possibility that they are tracking and selling the data of users that visit their sites, though we don't have any proof they're doing this. But there is another revenue stream, and it is where this story gets more interesting. MSN is one of the world's largest news aggregators. That means that it's a web service that collects news articles from places like the BBC, Reuters, Al Jazeera, whatever, and displays them all in one place. If you are running a Windows machine, MSN is the default news aggregator on your desktop. And they have a monetization scheme where adverts that are placed next to full articles displayed from a third-party site get their revenue split between MSN and that third-party site. And Climate Cosmos gets its content pulled by MSN and pushed into the feeds of millions of people.
The only reason we were seeing Climate Cosmos content is because it was coming up via MSN into our like kind of news wires. In order to be an MSN partner, you have to agree to abide by their content guidelines, one of which is to not post false information. And we found one article that actually made up the name of both a research institute and its findings. But you know, since we have started pursuing this story, all of the content on MSN has been taken down.
This was because, according to a spokesperson from Microsoft, the content violated its policies on misinformation. And so when Microsoft was made aware of the content, it was all pulled. But via the massive reach of MSN, Climate Cosmos's content had escaped into the wild, where it was seized upon by an entirely different kind of actor in the climate information landscape.
From the 1960s, it was very clear to scientists working in the fossil fuel industry that the fuels they were selling were leading to carbon building up in the atmosphere. In fact, in 1959, physicist Edward Teller warned them that this would lead to global warming and sea level rise. In 1965, President Johnson's Science Advisory Committee published the Restoring the Quality of Our Environment report. President of the American Petroleum Institute, Frank Ickard, said of the report, "One of the most important predictions of the report is that carbon dioxide is being added to the Earth's atmosphere by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas, at such a rate that by the year 2000, the heat balance will be so modified as possibly to cause marked changes in the climate beyond local or even national efforts." And he did not dispute the links between fossil fuels, CO2, and global warming.
In retrospect, it's kind of surprising that the fossil fuel industry didn't immediately start disputing those links and climate science as a whole. Because after all, if it became public knowledge that their products were threatening the climate stability that we all depend on, their industry could just cease to exist. Perhaps it was because no government was seriously considering actual climate policy until the 1980s. And it was at this time, when the existential threat to the industry became clear, that the fossil fuel companies started fighting back with all the resources of the richest, most powerful industry the world has ever seen.
They financed think tanks and individual scientists who disputed the scientific consensus, saying variously that climate change wasn't real but not caused by the fossil fuel industry, or real but actually beneficial to humanity. Their techniques included use of experts outside their fields of study, lobbying policymakers, portraying environmental campaigners as out-of-touch liberal elites, harassment and legal action against individual scientists, and accusing scientists of accepting money from industry, while paying other scientists to produce studies that supported the industry's continued survival.
The fossil fuel industry was using a playbook to dispute the science that had been honed by previous industrial misinformation campaigns, notably by the tobacco industry, when they disputed the science linking tobacco smoke and lung cancer. In fact, the fossil fuel industry used some of the same experts from that tobacco industry campaign. I would highly encourage you to read Merchants of Doubt by Oreskes and Conway, which is the authoritative account of how this playbook came to be. Though for more recent reporting, you can also read the Union of Concerned Scientists' Climate Deception Dossiers, or most recently, Barbara Fries's Industrial Strength Denial.
The result was that from the 1980s, the climate information landscape became a battleground. On the one side, you had climate scientists and institutions taking observations, doing analysis, and projecting what kind of damage would occur to the environment if we continued burning fossil fuels. Victory for this side meant getting accurate information about climate change to the public and ultimately to politicians, the end goal being government policy to bring down carbon emissions. But the fight was just about getting the information to the public. Of course, on the other side of this battlefield, you had the fossil fuel industry and their various proxies who agreed on the fundamental science and that serious environmental damage would occur if we kept burning fossil fuels. But based on valuing profit, and in the case of many of their proxies, a lack of government oversight, they fought to keep the public and politicians confused about and distrustful of climate science. And in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, they were successful. The consensus on climate change was muddied, the public unconvinced.
Of course, later we had breakthroughs like the Paris Agreement and the Inflation Reduction Act in the USA and the Climate Change Act in the UK. And you could be forgiven for thinking that, well, the war for climate information has been won by the scientists. The public now hears the scientific consensus. But while the scientists have definitely had the upper hand in the information war for the past couple of years, if you think that campaign groups, partly financed by the fossil fuel industry and partly by those just ideologically opposed to regulations on businesses, are a thing of the past, you would be sadly mistaken. Groups like the Heartland Institute and CFACT are very much still around and very vocal, still trying to convince people that the basic science around climate change is unfounded and untrustworthy and definitely not something to base government policy on. And you know what those two groups that I mentioned both have in common? They've both cited or reprinted Climate Cosmos content.
Which I think is quite funny because it maybe shows the editorial integrity of the anti-climate groups. Their work is supporting anti-climate voices in their own push.
The AI-generated content of Climate Cosmos has provided fuel to the targeted misinformation campaigns against climate action.
These articles are reinforcements in the renewed fight against accurate information about the climate.
Which raises the possibility that this is what the people behind Climate Cosmos wanted to do all along. Astroturfing, that is giving the impression of grassroots activism, but it's actually all artificial, dissent within the climate movement.
Now, as part of the article that Joey wrote about this investigation, which is linked below, by the way, he reached out to the 3 people he could confirm were actually real and not AI generated, associated with the site. And this is what Matthias Binder, director of Climate Cosmos, had to say. We have no interest in publishing or amplifying misinformation. The articles you referenced were taken offline as part of our ongoing quality review, and we are tightening our internal checks to ensure every author biography, citation, and data point is fully verifiable before publication. And indeed, all the articles that we've referenced so far in this video are only accessible through the Wayback Machine. After Joey reached out to Climate Cosmos, all of their climate content and the content from its sister sites disappeared from MSN.
Which you might take to mean that they've learned their lesson and will now be more careful in their use of AI. But since Joey reached out to them, they have posted more articles in the same vein, such as this one, highlighting the views of repeatedly disproven climate skeptics Richard Lindzen and John Christie, and they now have a YouTube channel. Hopefully I don't need to tell you that this is also AI slop. I mean, just look at how frequently they're releasing videos and everything. As it stands, we really don't know what the motivations behind Climate Cosmos are. The best clue we have is looking at one of the other definitely real people involved, Jan Otter.
Otter, who owns a third of the business, has repeatedly posted on social media about the role of AI agents in generating wealth and has reposted political content, including from Elon Musk. He also boasts on his LinkedIn page about the watch time and views received by his various publications. As far as we can tell, he doesn't have a strong stance on climate action one way or another.
Which leads me to believe that the people behind Climate Cosmos are not anti-science, climate misinformation activists, but tech bros trying to make money with AI. And how harmful can that be?
What the arrival of LLMs has done is it's made the cost of producing low quality explainer content without interview partners and without proper fact checking, that's very easy now. What's telling, I think, about the point we're at now is at least we can tell this stuff is AI generated for the moment. But imagine this situation in 5 or 10 years time when someone who works for chatbot companies watch this video even or taken on board our feedback, then I think we might be in real trouble when it comes to climate integrity and making sure that the information that people read about climate change is fact-checked and legitimate and accurate. It does not bode well for the future of journalism.
Climate Cosmos is not alone. There are increasing examples of AI-generated content within the climate information space, being used both by those explicitly opposed to climate action and those who are just seeking to profit from advertising revenue on sensationalist articles that get clicks because climate change is a hot topic. No pun intended. Climate Cosmos may seem harmless enough, but what they are doing is, to quote Steve Bannon, flooding the zone, just pumping out content, making it harder for the public to find accurate information about climate change written by experts.
Intention doesn't matter. The zone is being flooded with this mediocre, confusing, not fact-checked content, and that does crowd out good, accurate climate content like that from Carbon Brief or any of the thousands of good pieces of climate science and journalism that are being done all the time.
And this problem is only going to get much worse. Not just because AI content can be churned out much faster than expert-driven, fact-checked content, but because of the influence of AI-generated content on the next generation of generative AI tools.
You see, the way that AI tools are trained is through parsing vast amounts of data and recognizing patterns in it. In the case of a large language model, that means being fed a lot of text. And historically, that has come from books, transcripts of videos, and of course, websites, not all of which were stolen for this purpose.
But as the training datasets used to create new large language models get larger and larger, AI companies are facing the possibility of running out of new data to steal. And this paper from Nature estimates that this could happen as soon as 2028. To get around this, companies are increasingly training their new AI tools on data that was previously generated by an AI tool. Combined with the fact that high-quality training data, such as from academic journals or rigorous reporting, is often behind a paywall or is on a website that has a robots.txt file that blocks AI crawlers, the training data used to create next-generation models is increasingly formed of low-quality, SEO-optimized, and often AI-generated content. And this generates a feedback loop where misinformation can be amplified and become the mainstream. In a climate context, that means that next-generation LLMs risk parroting the talking points of climate skeptic groups or fossil fuel misinformation campaigns. In fact, this is one possible motivation behind Climate Cosmos, creating large volumes of climate skeptic talking points by just asking AI tools to churn them out, such that it will form a larger basis of the training datasets used to create future large language models. It's what we call LLM grooming. I should say, though, that we have no evidence that this is what Climate Cosmos is doing, it's just a possibility. We still don't know their actual motivations.
Regardless, the information landscape around climate change is being flooded by AI slop. Slop that is creating a feedback loop, intensifying the misinformation present in the tools used to create additional content. And scientists aren't just contending with AI slop, they are still facing intentional misinformation of varying degrees of severity, some straight-up denial of the basic science, and increasingly greenwashing by the fossil fuel industry.
Greenwashing is defined by the United Nations as misleading the public into believing that a company or other entity is doing more to protect the environment than they really are, delaying credible action on climate change. This can be claiming to be on track to net zero while not actually having a plan to do so, touting unrealistic or unproven solutions, or emphasizing one small clean part of their operations while ignoring the polluting majority. And this is all in addition to the generic rehabilitation of their image that's being attempted through, for example, sponsoring sports to the tune of £4 billion. And this has the effect of making the public believe that fossil fuel companies are not the root cause of the problem. They're dynamic companies leading us into the future and not, in fact, expanding their traditional operations and locking in further emissions. Greenwashing is another form of misinformation, just a more subtle one, that now appears on the climate information battlefield. But it is not the most significant change to that battlefield in recent years.
When on the campaign trail, Donald Trump was associated with a set of policies known as Project 2025, published by the right-wing Heritage Foundation. These policies included mass deportation of undocumented immigrants, criminalizing abortion, and consolidating power in the executive branch in order to create an authoritarian Christian nationalist government. Trump distanced himself from these extreme policies while campaigning, but within hours of winning the 2024 election, his allies revealed that Project 2025 was indeed the agenda of the new government.
And Project 2025 had a lot to say about climate change. Notably, it pledged to slash the budget of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Energy Department's renewable energy offices and block the expansion of the American grid with clean technologies. And since Trump was elected, all of these things have happened. But what I think has gone beyond even the most pessimistic observers' fears is this administration's explicit attack on the scientific establishment.
Funding for the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, source of the data in the iconic Keeling curve of CO2 concentrations, has been cut. Funding for orbiting carbon observatories monitoring CO2 emissions has been cut, quote, to align with the president's agenda and budget priorities. Meanwhile, the Department for Defense announced it will no longer share its satellite data with scientists, including hurricane forecasters. References to climate change on government websites have been purged, and almost all staff working on climate.gov were fired. Hundreds of employees have been terminated at the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, with the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research having almost 3/4 of its budget removed, which will, quote, eliminate all funding for climate, weather, and ocean laboratories and cooperative institutes, being activities that, quote, are misaligned with the president's agenda and the express will of the American people.
And last month, the administration put out a critical assessment of climate science to justify these actions, written by 5 hand-picked climate skeptics. It contains over 100 errors in its 140 pages, ranging from straight-up lies to egregious misrepresentation of actual research. The polemic language of Project 2025, and thus now the Trump administration, especially in this new report, exactly mirrors that of early fossil fuel propaganda, disputing the basic science, downplaying the risks of climate change, and denouncing those who want to reduce emissions as extremists. And this is because the Heritage Foundation has received direct funding from the fossil fuel industry, and indirectly from the billionaires who made their fortunes in the fossil fuel industry. For a comprehensive account on who is funding the Heritage Foundation and who is working for them, including several long-term recipients of fossil fuel funding, check out DSMOG's extensive database entry on them.
The US government is currently sabotaging those scientists trying to get information out to the public. It is acting as another very powerful proxy of the fossil fuel industry. Between their gutting of the output of scientists, new forms of misinformation from the fossil fuel industry, and the ever-multiplying flood of AI slop content, we face the very real possibility of a near future where it is almost impossible to find accurate information about climate change, its root causes, the latest observations of temperature or carbon emissions, and which solutions will actually help the situation. The information battlefield will have been lost. The public will not be informed of the environmental disaster unfolding around them, let alone why it is happening or what they can do about it.
The current best guess for global warming by 2100 is 2.7 degrees Celsius. That's based on current actions, not projecting anything into the future. And at that level of warming, it is really quite likely that some climate systems will go through tipping points. That is, changing irreversibly on human timescales to some new state that the natural world is not adapted to. It is not an exaggeration to say that the course we are currently on threatens the future of civilization and life as we know it. And I've said in goodness knows how many videos now, it doesn't have to be this way. We know which policies and which technologies will work in bringing down emissions. That same research group that predicts 2.7 degrees by 2100 also says that 1.9 degrees by 2100 is entirely within our reach. Yet, the fundamental prerequisite for action to limit climate change, access to information about climate change, is under threat, crowded out by easy-to-produce slop that will only be fed more and more misinformation and obscured or cut off at the source by politicians captured by the industry who have the most to lose from climate action. And this isn't some debate about the finer points of the science or interpretation. On the one side of this information battlefield, you have scientists taking observations and doing analysis. The other side are lying.
And the lies, carefully or carelessly wielded by those on this battlefield, have devastating consequences. Lies that condemn entire species to extinction. Lies that create famines. Lies that are already killing people and will kill far more in the years to come.
I started this video with the story about Climate Cosmos because there's something about that story that just feels irresponsible. Like it feels wrong that people can do this. And when in a society we encounter behavior that feels wrong or irresponsible or especially dangerous, we include that behavior in our laws. We make it illegal to do that thing. Intentionally lying about climate change is dangerous. It feels irresponsible and wrong. I think it should be illegal. And I'm not the only one. That's also the opinion of UN Special Rapporteur Professor Elisa Morguera, who earlier this summer published a report recommending, among other things, criminalization of misinformation and greenwashing by the fossil fuel industry. But what may surprise you is her reasoning behind this. It's nothing to do with the environmental impacts.
Climate disinformation leads to a separate series of human rights impacts, infringing our human right to information, to benefit from science, to be able to participate in decision making, but it also undermines our human rights in terms of impeding public action to better protect us, undermining, what could have been more effective protection of our human rights.
And this may well be the foundation for groundbreaking new law.
By the way, if you're enjoying this video, maybe enjoying is the wrong word, please consider supporting me on patreon.com/SimonOxFizz. Patreon is my largest revenue stream and ensures I can pay my bills each month, including paying talented artists to work with me while bringing out these videos. In exchange for as little as £3 a month, you get early access to my videos, exclusive content every month, you've been watching a bit of my monthly behind-the-scenes vlog, and at higher tiers can vote on video topics for me to cover, as well as getting your name in each video. Thank you so much to all my patrons, and a special thank you to Leander Baumann, Tiger Toomey, and Adam Scott. And now, could you summarize what the main conclusions of your report to the UN were?
Yeah, so my report was really to clarify how international human rights law states have obligations to phase out fossil fuels production and use. And the idea was to bring together different areas of evidence, so climate science, but also health science, telling us that fossil fuels harm every organ in our body. Also looking at how plastics, which is a product related to fossil fuels, also harm us in so many ways across generations. And the key clarifications in the report is that states must, in different timelines, phase out fossil fuels as an obligation to protect our human rights. And finally, defossilize knowledge. So really tackle both the causes and the results of those decades of climate disinformation, because that in itself impedes progress at the pace we need to prevent even more catastrophic impacts of climate change on our lives and well-being.
Legal challenges to stop climate change have historically not been terribly successful. Clearly. And one of the reasons for this is that historically they have focused on the environmental harms caused by polluters. The high watermark for such legal action actually just occurred a few weeks ago when the International Court of Justice delivered a unanimous advisory opinion, one of only 5 unanimous opinions in 88 years, that countries have obligations under general international law to prevent significant harm to the environment, and that in principle countries can be held liable for climate damages, including that inflicted by private corporations within a country. This is a landmark moment. It is almost certainly going to go in a lot of future history textbooks. But it's still an advisory opinion. The ICJ has huge sway, and its opinions are referred to when domestic courts, like here in the UK, make their rulings. But this opinion is not going to stop fossil fuel producers from selling their products, or, more relevantly, creating misinformation. In order for that to happen, a law would need to go on the books somewhere significant, and we'll talk about where that might be in the next section, that would explicitly criminalize the creation of misinformation about climate change and have clear penalties for violations.
Professor Morguera, in her report, actually recommends several activities for criminalization. Misinformation and misrepresentation by the fossil fuel industry, including failure to disclose corporate lobbying activities, and the amplification of disinformation and misinformation created by the fossil fuel industry by media and advertising firms.
I hope the argument for this has been made clear by now. Climate misinformation produces clear and demonstrable harms both to the environment and to us and our human rights. But the obvious counter-argument is, What about my freedom of speech? Why can't I say what I want even though I know that something is inaccurate?
I mean, it is essential to protect freedom of speech. And in all my work, I've always mentioned how important it is to have as open conversations as possible. Now, the question here is different if this is a conduct that's been repeated and that over time has led to the protection of a vested interest, which is intrinsically opposite to the protection of a public good. I mean, climate change has been recognized as structural violence against children, for instance, by the UN Committee on Children's Rights. And incitation to violence is, for instance, one of the very few exceptions that has been recognized to freedom of expression.
I think there's two things to highlight here that Professor Morgera said. Firstly, this is not a law that is criminalizing ignorance about climate change. Like, just saying something wrong wouldn't break this hypothetical law. We're talking about a law that's quite explicitly targeting the fossil fuel industry that has a long history of acting against the public good. And secondly, by basing the argument for this law on human rights violations rather than environmental harm, you have strong precedent to build on. Other cases where structural harms to a group's human rights have been criminalized. In a way, this proposed law would be no different to a law requiring an industry, like any industry, to act in a way that doesn't cause human rights violations.
Compare it to another example of structural harms against human rights: modern slavery. There is no universal definition of modern slavery, but it fundamentally comes down to a person being controlled by another person through threat of force, something that sadly still applies to tens of millions of people around the world.
A person in slavery is clearly having their human rights infringed upon, and a person who is keeping people in slavery, whether that's through inflicting violence or human trafficking, is clearly liable for those harms. But so too is any company that profits from the labor those enslaved people perform. For example, fishermen in places like Thailand are often trafficked and forced to work on boats for up to years at a time under the threat of violence. 59% of trafficked migrants who were interviewed in Thailand by the Environmental Justice Foundation reported witnessing the murder of a fellow worker. 59%. And obviously, the people inflicting that violence are liable for human rights abuses. But so too is any company that buys the fish those enslaved people catch, if they know that is who is doing the work.
To this end, last year the EU passed the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which requires large companies in the EU to conduct due diligence in their operations and their supply chain to diminish the risk of human rights violations.
The UN defines climate change as a form of structural violence towards children, and thus a human rights violation. So to me, it's pretty clear that the creation of misinformation about climate change, or the knowing amplification of misinformation, acts in furtherance of that violence. So a law of the type that Professor Morgera is proposing has direct precedent in the EU. And, to bring things back to Climate Cosmos, a law that would also target the creation of AI slop climate misinformation.
What do you think about the legal responsibility of companies like Google and OpenAI that create these large language models that are being used to create climate misinformation? Is the legal responsibility with the company, or is it with the user asking their tools to make the misinformation?
Responsibility is of the companies, and in fact my report did make a specific finding relating to how much now AI and big tech may be becoming part of the playbook. More and more, not only they are supporting, spreading of climate disinformation through social media platforms and AI generated content, but there's also evidence that this is a revenue sharing model with the fossil fuel companies. So in a way, what used to be an expense for fossil fuels to try and misconstrue the reality to the public, now it's becoming something that gives them even more profit. Any company that may find themselves in a situation where they might spread more climate disinformation should be very aware that this leads to a violation of human rights. But secondly, of course, if you have companies who are making a profit and making it part of their business model, of their partnerships in implementing the playbook, this is an even higher level of responsibility.
And I should say that companies that create LLMs are largely aware that their products can create misinformation and are taking steps to prevent it. For example, some companies like Anthropic are hard coding in limits into their models so that if a user, for example, asked Claude to create climate misinformation or, I don't know, copyright protected content, then the model would just refuse to output it. But this isn't standard across the board. And in an attempt to minimize the risk of LLM grooming, or more broadly, slop-on-slop training, companies pay experts to manually flag AI-generated or misleading content in their training datasets. I would hope because that's kind of basic corporate responsibility, doing the right thing. But as we have seen, especially recently in America, these companies don't care about doing the right thing, at least in certain political contexts. They're only going to do what they are legally required to do. And I think that should include abiding by a law that means they don't spread the misinformation created by the fossil fuel industry. Which does lead us to the question, the ultimate question. How? In talking about criminalizing misinformation about the climate crisis, we're really talking about two distinct things. Firstly, the creation of misinformation, notably by the fossil fuel industry, and secondly, the amplification of that misinformation by people who know it to be incorrect and harmful. It may well be that both things could be covered by the same law, but I think it's much more likely that they'd be covered separately. Let's start with the second point, the amplification of misinformation, including, calling back to Climate Cosmos, by generative AI tools. Let's be real, generative AI companies are basically all in the USA, and right now are likely protected under US law by Section 230 of the US Communications and Decency Act.
This effectively says that companies like Meta and X are not liable for the content created on their platforms by users. The users are instead liable. In theory, AI-generated content would also be protected under this section, but no one has legally tested that yet. Opinions do vary about the level of protection Section 230 offers.
At minimum, it would make pursuing liability for climate misinformation created by an AI tool very difficult. There are ongoing lawsuits to do with the output of AI tools, such as that looking at clearly copyright material from Disney, but I don't think there's any strong precedent for a climate misinformation law that we could look to.
And anyway, the Trump administration is working to remove ideological bias and Marxist lunacy from AI models in their AI action plan, which rewrites the AI risk management framework to, quote, eliminate references to misinformation, diversity, equity and inclusion, and climate change. And this was before the AI industry spent $100 million lobbying the government to roll back legislation. So yeah, I don't think AI companies have anything to worry about in the US.
I did actually ask my friend Devin, aka Legal Eagle, for his professional opinion about whether a law criminalizing the creation or amplification of climate misinformation would ever go on the books in the US. And his full reply was,
yeah, not really. Laws like that don't really fly in the United States because of the First Amendment. Better luck next time.
Thanks, Devin. For the time being, we can pretty safely say that the US is out of the legal picture. But there's very much still hope with option 2, or should I say, duh.
The Brussels effect refers to the process of regulations from the European Union having impacts far beyond Europe's borders. Europe is a huge market, and it is often the case that it's cheaper for global companies to simply comply with European law everywhere rather than just in Europe. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the charging port on iPhones. In 2022, the European Parliament passed a directive that required many consumer electronics to use USB-C as their charging port by 2024, the idea being that new devices didn't need to come with new chargers, and so electronic waste would be minimized. Apple had up until this point used a custom charging port on iPhones, but in order to comply with the new law, updated their designs to include USB-C charging from the iPhone 15 onwards. Other examples include the introduction of GDPR by Facebook and Microsoft, however imperfectly, and airlines improving airplane fuel efficiency.
Do I have problems with the fact that Europe can set laws that even people outside of their borders have to abide by? Yeah. Though I should say I still voted Remain. But while that is the reality, a realistic option for a law criminalizing the amplification of climate misinformation is through the EU. More specifically, we can take inspiration from the Digital Services Act, which came into force in 2022. This law basically says that platforms online have some fundamental responsibilities around transparency and removing illegal content. And additionally, that very large platforms, so like Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, that kind of thing, have additional responsibilities to control the spread of misinformation. Well, the law doesn't explicitly say misinformation. It basically says that very large platforms have to regularly assess how their services may be being used to spread content that is illegal or detrimental to the public good, such as misinformation, and then take steps to limit the risk of this happening, such as, for example, changing their recommendation algorithms.
If companies don't comply with this law, they can be fined up to 6% of their global annual turnover. And the EU follows through with these fines. Earlier this year, they fined Apple and Meta a combined €700 million for breaching a similar law, the Digital Markets Act.
The Digital Services Act is probably the closest precedent we have for a law targeting the spread of climate misinformation, though it actually doesn't include the use of generative tools like, for example, ChatGPT. And it's also worth saying that there's no guarantee that just because this becomes law in Europe, that American companies will abide by it in their operations outside of Europe's borders. But if you live in the EU, here's something concrete you can do. Contact your MEPs. If you don't know who they are or how to contact them, please check out this website and ask them if they would support a law similar to the Digital Services Act that would target the spread of misinformation about climate change online. Though such a law can only be proposed by someone in the EU Commission, most likely actually by the head of Tech Sovereignty, Security and Democracy, currently Henna Virkkunen from Finland.
By the way, if you'd like to learn more about how the EU functions and creates laws, because it is complicated, check out the EU Made Simple channel, who were nice enough to walk me through the process.
So as well as contacting the MEPs that represent you could also contact Virkkunen's team and ask them what their stance is on a law criminalizing climate misinformation. You could even suggest what one might look like. I'm not aware of a specific campaign to get the EU to adopt such a law, but I would love to learn of one. If it turns out that no such campaign exists, maybe viewers of this channel could even start one.
This would certainly target websites like Climate Cosmos and hopefully restrict the flood of AI slop crowding out accurate information. But we still need to address the creation of misinformation by those who stand to gain the most from it.
What about criminalizing misinformation from the fossil fuel industry? Well, we actually have direct precedent here. Do you remember how I said that the fossil fuel industry is using a playbook that's heavily inspired by, directly copied from, the tobacco industry? Well, the misinformation about the link between tobacco products and lung cancer was eventually contained and actually beaten. That information battlefield was won.
It was won in the teeth of industry opposition over a very long period of time. It was won in different ways, in different places, and with a range of tactics and techniques, parliamentary gambits, some people pioneering and going first. But the interesting thing about it, I think that was decisive, it was people who were working in health and health specialists who built up an evidence base over decades and were dogged in their pursuit.
This is Andrew Sims from Scientists for Global Responsibility and the New Weather Institute, who, along with some excellent colleagues, has created the Badvertising campaign, seeking to recreate the success that led to the downfall of tobacco misinformation in the climate space.
So when we beat the tobacco industry, was there at any point a law written that basically says it's illegal to tell lies about this stuff?
There's been two things happening. One is the legislative ban on advertising, marketing and sponsorship. And that didn't happen in one foul swoop. It was incrementally tightened and increased over a period of time. But then what you get is basically a sectoral ban on the promotion, marketing and sponsorship activities of tobacco marketing companies. So if we were to transpose that and ask the same question now, what would that look like in the era of climate change? Well, Our take on it is that the logical thing to do is to stop promoting our own self-destruction. We're already seeing at municipal level, at local government level, people taking up that call and introducing advertising bans. So we've seen cities in the UK, places like Sheffield and Edinburgh introducing, and lots of others as well, introducing sort of quite good policies. The Hague was a pioneering city introducing such a policy, and they recently upgraded it to the level of law. So it's now become part of their local law in The Hague. In Spain recently, not perfect, but they're introducing a ban on the advertising of internal combustion engine cars. So things are starting to happen.
So rather than making it a crime to lie about this stuff, instead, based on decades of their abuse of their platforms, just limit the industry's ability to target the public directly at all, at least in a given country. As I already said, this has direct precedent, it's straightforward, and I think would enjoy broad support from the public, because, like, who feels passionately positive about advertising?
But again, this isn't going to fly in the USA, at least for the moment.
Fortunately, it's not the only option.
And it could happen at different levels. It could be individual states doing it. It could be the EU. It could even be internationally. There's been already proposals to have an international crime, either related to ecocide or even to misinformation as such. And interestingly, this was coming from children's rights experts and organizations, for instance.
To call out one specific example of international law, a piece of EU legislation that has actually already been passed and will come into force next year is the Directive on Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition, or ECGT. This basically says it will be a crime for companies to use wishy-washy language around how green they are, so tackling one form of misinformation. But again, we run into the issue that there's no guarantee the Brussels effect will be global.
How you police or how you legislate multinational activity is a really thorny problem, and it's a very difficult thing to do. How you would regulate these big multinational influencing platforms when it's very hard just to get them to kind of play nicely about stuff that you think would be perfectly normal, about extreme behavior and hostile and abusive other forms of abusive content. If you look at the last kind of couple of 100 years, there was a real time lag between the emergence of our own aggressive industrial economy and the checks and balances around protections for people in work and health and safety and environmental things. Getting those in place was all hard fought over many decades. But there you've got a clear democratic and political system with national bodies that have got, roles and powers, but you just don't have that at the international level.
Talking to Andrew and Professor Morgera, it's clear that this is not going to be as simple as just passing a law, even internationally, that says it's illegal to tell porcupines about climate change. The apparatus for such a law to exist and have teeth just doesn't exist yet. Instead, effective legislation is going to be more granular, requiring laws at international, yes, but also national and local levels, targeting highly polluting industries and their enablers. And actually, maybe most of all to begin with, going after their advertising specifically. If that's something you would like to be part of, learning from previous defeats of misinformation, then Andrew's campaign Badvertising is taking targeted action. And they also have a newsletter. Check out their website. And this is something you can be involved with at a local level. Write to your regional or local or city government and ask them, are they okay with fossil fuel companies spreading misinformation in their constituency, impacting the lives and human rights of their constituents? You may even want to get involved with the people at Ad-Free Cities. They're also linked down below.
I think lying about climate change should carry a massive health warning. And I think that people who operate platforms that carry climate misinformation should be held to account. Misinformation is a problem. Information which is trying to persuade us to act and behave in a certain way that makes the climate emergency even worse is also a problem. And one of the easiest ways you can deal with that is by removing it from the conversation. We had the precedent with tobacco even though the industry fought tooth and nail for decades to prevent there being a ban on the kind of information that encouraged people to smoke who wouldn't have done otherwise. We passed that. We're now in a situation where even though the whole of science is telling us we've got to stop polluting, huge swathes of the economy through its advertising and promotion are telling us to keep on doing what we're doing, business as usual, keep on polluting, take that long haul flight, drive that massive SUV, keep the fossil fuel economy going. And I think an immediate and practical thing that we can do is stop promoting our own self-destruction and have a tobacco-style ban law that prevents us promoting the most polluting products, lifestyles, and services. And that'll be a great place to start.
We are losing the information war on climate. I think in large part because a lot of people don't realize we are fighting an information war about the climate. Scientists are in a desperate struggle against the same misinformation campaigns they've always squared off against, funded by the fossil fuel industry and right-wing groups opposed to government legislation. But they are now also fighting a rearguard action against the most powerful government on Earth and seeing hordes of AI-generated slop on the horizon, poised to pollute the battlefield, some of it generated maliciously, and some of it simply to make a profit without any regard for the consequences.
Climate Cosmos is just the tip of the iceberg, and without timely intervention, the collapse of our society, this century or next, will be preceded by the collapse in the information system around our climate. The situation is grim, but as I've laid out in this video, there is plenty that we can do. And in fact, there is a lot being done around the world right now. People like Joey and his colleagues at DSmog are calling out the purveyors of misinformation and their tactics. As I've stressed through this video, without information and awareness, we can do nothing. These journalists are deserving of your support. But just as with climate change itself, making people aware of the problem is just the first step. In order to turn the tide on the information battlefield, we need new legislation, new laws to prevent scientists' voices from being drowned out.
People like Professor Morgera are campaigning at the highest levels for the international community to recognize the playbook used by the fossil fuel industry and, based on the harms it has inflicted and continues to inflict, not least of which on our human rights, educate the public and criminalize its use, and address the platforms and generative tools which amplify the reach of misinformation.
But this will not be accomplished only through international law. It will take national and local legislation. And I've given you a bunch of resources and campaigns and even people that you can get involved with. If this issue matters to you, this is how you can take part. Lying about climate change should have consequences. Well, actually, it already has consequences. Lying about climate change destabilizes the planetary life support systems that we all depend on. It makes the forests and coral reefs that our children will experience less colorful, less beautiful, less full of life. It threatens our children's access to food, to drinking water, to safety. Lying about climate change should be illegal, and we know how to make it so.
As we've stressed through this video, the fundamental underpinning of combating climate change is access to information. Data. In fact, data is the fundamental underpinning of all science. But data itself is not useful. It has to be analysed, interpreted, and explored. Imagine, for example, that you've got data on how much different Airbnbs charge in different neighbourhoods, and you want to know if it would be more profitable to make an entire home available as an Airbnb or offer individual private rooms. Well, you're going to need to know how to analyze that data, filtering to find only those relevant properties and then calculating their total revenues. And you can do exactly that as part of the Exploring Data Visually course on Brilliant.org, who made this video possible.
Brilliant is an educational website and app designed to be uniquely effective. By getting you hands-on with new topics and playing as a form of learning, you pick up new ideas up to 6 times faster than by just watching a lecture video on the subject.
Brilliant is stuffed with interactive courses across maths, science, data science, and programming, written by an award-winning team of researchers, teachers, and professionals. And you can access these courses on your web browser or through their dedicated app.
The app in particular is excellent at helping you build a daily learning habit. Bite-sized lessons that you can do in just a couple of minutes, and doing that every day means you go from foundational ideas to really quite advanced topics before you know it. It's something that I do every day. Brilliant have partnered with me for the best part of a decade now, and that's because the people that watch my videos tend to get a lot out of Brilliant. So if you haven't tried them yet and you'd like to improve your problem-solving skills or your specific skills in an area of maths or science, I would highly recommend them. And the best part is you can get learning for free by going to brilliant.org/Simon Clark, which is also linked in the QR code. And if you go to that link, you'll also get a 20% discount on a premium annual subscription to Brilliant. That link again was brilliant.org/Simon Clark, with massive thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. This was an unusual video to make, starting with a collaboration with Joey from DSmog, and then incorporating interviews from more than, actually, 5 experts, including Professor Morgera and Andrew Sims. And it just kind of kept growing and growing into what it eventually became, hence why it's been quite a while since the last video came out. Sorry. I hope you'll agree that the end result was worth it. I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who made this one possible, not least of which my editor Luke, who has been heroically struggling through mountains of footage for literal weeks. And of course, thank you for watching. If you'd like to watch something else from me, then here's 2 videos I prepared earlier. I'm just going to remind you that if you like this video and would like to see me make more, then you can support me on Patreon. And thank you again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.